Right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm deadly worried that my paper is a bit too long, and I really hope I don't send anybody to sleep. Fingers crossed. So, M.R. James, if you're here from the M.R. James group, thank you very much. I'm honoured. No pressure. So, Aural, Haunting, and the Stories of M.R. James. In many respects, hearing is the primary human sense. We are largely unable to select what we hear and what we do not hear, and cannot physically easily defend ourselves against the audible, which leaves us vulnerable to both physical and psychological disturbance. Personally, if I hear something and I can't see it, that creeps me out much more. The ear favours no particular point of view, so we can't shut sound out automatically, not even my son with his noise cancellors. It doesn't work. We simply are not equipped with ear lids like we are with eyelids. Disturbing images may be shut out by closing the eyes, but there is little protection from disturbing aurality. Perceiving disturbing sounds from an invisible source will arouse feelings of trepidation, which makes the auditory a perfect vehicle for conveying terror. If one hears a potentially threatening sound but cannot see its source, the ensuing sense of terror is heightened. So there's our lovely man, M.R. James. Regarding the short story craft, M.R. James contended that two ingredients most valuable in the concocting of a ghost story are, to me, the atmosphere and the nicely managed crescendo. Through the use of sound, and indeed the absence of sound, he was able to concoct an atmosphere of malevolence, what one of his biographers called his executors of unappeasable malice. They're often heard rather than seen. The emphasis on sound and its manipulation may be traced to the fact that James was an oral storyteller before he was a writer of fiction, and that his tales were originally intended for a listening audience rather than a reading one. In the study of the Provost's Lodge at King's College, Cambridge, James positioned himself as an ample and benign scholar with gold-rimmed spectacles, quietly recounting tales of unimaginable horror. That's according to his most famous biographer, Cox. A number of his stories were read to the Chit-Chat Society at Cambridge, beginning with Canon Alberich's scrapbook in October 1893. By 1900, the stories had become a yearly ritual, enjoyed by a gathering of James's closest friends at King's over Christmas, hence Ghost Stories for Christmas. James had no need of props or bombast. His quiet and understated method of delivery worked to create an atmosphere of dread without recourse to thespian techniques of projection. He definitely wasn't a Dickens, and was all the better for it as far as I'm concerned. Among his many academic achievements, M.R. James was a polyglot. He was fluent in Latin, Greek, Coptic, French, Swedish, and Danish. These last two he taught himself in order to read Scandinavian folklore, a traditionally oral mode of communication, for which being able to hear and digest the tales in their original language was essential to an appreciation of the nuances required for optimum effect. James was described by numerous biographers, such as having a natural ear for language. His mimetic brilliance was also widely remarked upon. Impersonations of friends and colleagues were uncannily accurate, and this talent for mimicry is an important factor in the success of his readings. James's most terrifying ghosts excuse me, are invisible. their presence marked by rustling, crying, whispering, and in a neighbour's landmark of 1924, by diabolical shrieking. These acoustic presences are elements within a fluidity of soundscapes. It is due to the shifting nature of the size of the sounds, their shape and character moment by moment. They overlap each other. They leach into each other in unpredictable ways. This is perfectly illustrated in the maze scene in Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance from 1911, in which the protagonist is left disoriented by sounds of an indeterminate nature which follow him, shifting and overlapping as they do so. In the stories of M.R. James, sounds are alien, savage, and malevolent. This talk focuses on 4 stories by James, each of which exhibits a disturbing aurality, which haunted his listeners and continues to haunt his readers. Number 13 from 1904, A Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, from the same year for obvious reasons. Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance for 1911, and A Neighbour's Landmark. By exploring the primalness of the auditory, we can see how James utilized sound to promulgate terror through auditory images as elusive shapeshifters. So let's begin with number 13. Madge Nicholas Franken is an executor of unappeasable malice who, when he is heard, is not visible. But when he is seen, it is always indirectly via reflections and shadows in silence, until the end, of course. Franken inhabits room 13 at the Golden Lion Hotel, a room that only exists at night, and for which the neighbouring rooms 12 and 14 adjust their proportions at night in order to accommodate it. The blackboard in the hotel lobby does not list a number 13, which leaves Anderson, the guest in number 12, in some perplexity when he mistakenly tries to open the door to number 13, thinking it is his. Confusion is compounded by the fact that when Anderson does gain access to number 12, it seems to have contracted in length and grown proportionally higher. However, by daylight, his room does indeed feature the requisite height and number of windows. When the door marked 13 appears in the evenings, Anderson can hear footsteps and voices, or a voice, within, which suddenly cease when Anderson stands directly outside. He hears a quick hissing breathing as of a person in strong excitement, and wonders if he has been subjected to a repeated auditory hallucination by night that cannot be corroborated by visual evidence during the day. Anderson begins to doubt his state of mind, wondering if his sight or his brain were giving way. It is noticeable that his sight is the first of his senses that Anderson questions. For once eye culture usurped ear culture when oral traditions were replaced by the written word in the 15th century, the visual came to be regarded as more comprehensive and trustworthy sense, while the oral was left behind, with associations of passivity, superstition, hearsay. In modern culture, seeing something provides better proof than hearing something. However, in James's tales, it is Anderson's sight which becomes questionable to him, not what he hears. The hotel proprietor, Herr Christensen, laughs with scorn when he's questioned by Anderson and emphasizes with much iteration the fact that no number 13 existed or had ever existed in that hotel. This leaves Anderson uncertain, wondering whether or not he has been the subject of some kind of illusion. Emphasis in this story is placed on sensory disorientation. James presents Anderson's perplexity with a sudden shift from the occupant of the eponymous room, having previously only been heard, to his now being perceived visually by Anderson through his window in number 12 via shadows on the facing wall. The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he, Franken, was dancing. Again and again, his thin form crossed the window. His arms waved. A gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be barefooted, and the floor must be well laid, for no sound betrayed his movements. Herr Christensen's knock at the door and his subsequent entry into Anderson's room serves to shift Anderson's attention from one dubious visual perception to another. To judge from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christensen was struck, as Anderson had been, by something unusual in its aspect. Focus then shifts once again from the visual to the aural, when both Anderson and Christensen suddenly hear singing from what they think is number 14, in which currently resides a staid lawyer, Herr Jensen. It was a high, thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. It went sailing up to a surprising height and was carried down with a disappearing moan, as if winter wind in a hollow chimney or an organ whose wind fails suddenly. It was a really horrible sound, and Anderson felt that if he had been alone, he must have fled for refuge. The landlord sat open-mouthed. James here conveys an atmosphere of eeriness via metaphors of sonic desolation. The sound is dry, almost tactile, an entity that sails up and down, disappearing with a moan. It is an image of sound represented visually, creating an awareness in the reader of a quality of otherness, of something alien. Herr Jensen in number 14 thinks the unearthly din is being created by persons in number 12, yet is brought up short when he storms in to confront them. But what in the name of heaven does it mean? Where is it? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind? The 19th century French psychiatrist Jean-Étienne Esquerot believed hallucinations occurred as a result of the brain creating sensory impressions, which were, in fact, illusions, or what Esquerot termed sensory errors. By the 1890s, when James was beginning to compose his tales of terror, Esquerot's theories were widely accepted throughout Europe, and treating hallucinations had become a major occupational concern for the relatively new science of psychiatry. James here appears to be questioning the validity of a sensory error being experienced simultaneously by different individuals. The shock of the acoustic experience has caused the protagonists to doubt their own sanity. The vocal sounds emanating from, number 13 alternate between hideous singing and crooning laughter, which leaves the men shivering at the sound. When they decide to investigate this grotesque aural phenomenon, they find themselves enveloped by a sudden, deadly quiet. as they face the now plainly visible door marked with the number 13. This particular circumstance highlights the inexplicability of the whole episode, and that an emphasis on engagement with one sense will result in the deprivation of another. Here, the visual comes with a sudden silence. No matter our religious beliefs, the unassailable physical fact is that the phenomenon of voice hearing must have a neurological correlate that, in theory, we can explain, chart, describe. But the vocal sounds heard by Anderson, Jensen, and Christensen, emanating from number 13, cannot be explained or charted. They are not sensory errors. They are episodes of sounds that occur in a room that does not physically exist. Here, James presents eye culture as having no monopoly over ear culture when it comes to sensory reliability. So that brings us to what is possibly his most famous story. O Whistle and I Come to You, My Lad is probably the best known of M.R. James's ghost stories. It's been adapted for radio and television numerous times. The face of crumpled linen is certainly one of the most disturbing images in James's fictional oeuvre. But it is the rich sonic tapestry comprising whistle, wind, and wailing that makes the story memorable. They are sounds that herald a psychic crisis of personal doubt. Like the majority of James's protagonists, Professor Parkins is a Cambridge don, a bachelor and a cynic with regards to the spirit world. For him, concession to anything which cannot be adequately explained, such as ghosts, is equivalent to a renunciation of all that he holds most sacred. He heads to the seaside hamlet of Burnstow, the fictional equivalent of Felixstowe, in order to pursue research and improve his golfing skills, of course. A colleague, who is planning an archaeological dig, asks him to examine a Templar preceptory while he's there. Parkins duly does so and comes across a whistle concealed in a cavity, the cylindrical object making a metallic clink when he discovers it, already producing a sound before being seen or used. Thus, Parkins begins his engagement with an alien environment. The minute he deposits the whistle in his pocket and heads back to his hotel, he attains a heightened sense of awareness of the ambient sounds of the natural world. He becomes acutely aware, for instance, of the dim and murmuring sea, of how his feet rattle and clash through the shingle. When Parkins turns to look back down the beach towards the Templar site he has just left, he suddenly notices the shape of a rather indistinct personage. As with the gentleman at the Golden Lion Hotel in number 13, it is the visual that remains questionable, not the aural. By introducing the whistle, James creates a sonic environment in which the sound emitted is diffused to listeners, both human and revenant. Upon inspection of the whistle, Parkins finds two inscriptions. Apologies for my absolutely rubbish Latin. Farfla bis flee, which he translates as thief, if you blow, you will weep, and Kisesti ki unit, you tell me, which Parkins translates as, who is it that comes? Knowledge of Latin was a prerequisite for studying at Cambridge until after the first half of the 20th century. Thus, the character Parkins has no excuse for subsequently ignoring the warning he has just read. He blew tentatively and stopped suddenly, startled and yet pleased at the note he had elicited. It had a quality of infinite distance in it, and, soft as it was, he somehow felt it must be audible for miles around. It was a sound, too, that seemed to have the power which many scents possess of forming pictures in the brain. He saw quite clearly, for a moment, a vision of a wide, dark expanse at night, with a fresh wind blowing, and in the midst a lonely figure. How employed he could not tell. Perhaps he would have seen more had not the picture been broken by the sudden surge of a gust of wind against his casement, so sudden that it made him look up. The description of a sound containing an infinite distance and being audible over great expanses, even though its timbre is soft, invokes a sense of auditory otherness, an alien quality that defies constraint within a particular soundscape. The hypnotic effect of the sound of the whistle is such that it induces a vivid visual image for Parkins. Being utterly absorbed by his new discovery, Parkins blows the whistle again, of course, unaware of what he has summoned. The sound of the whistle had so fascinated him that he could not help trying it once more, this time more boldly. The note was little, if at all, louder than before, and repetition broke the illusion. No picture followed, as he had half hoped it might. But what is this? Goodness! What force the wind can get up in a few minutes! What a tremendous gust! It's enough to tear the room to pieces. The enthrallment produced by the first sounding of the whistle is broken by repetition, for the object's purpose has now been achieved, the conjuring of a malevolent revenant. The auditory phenomenon of standing wave of sound involves sound folding back upon itself and building up in complex layers. By blowing the whistle, Parkins has unleashed a sensory wave of folding sound, perceived both by himself and the revenant the whistle has summoned. Particular objects possess a tonal frequency which triggers a feedback loop, rather hypnotic in quality and inducing a moment of vivid mental imagery and hallucination. Parkins's momentary vision of a wide, dark expanse at night, in the midst of which stands a lonely figure, is then torn to pieces by the wall of wind which now pummels his seaside hotel in response to the call of the whistle. Even the cynical bachelor Don Parkins is perturbed by this disturbing aural event. Quickly as it had risen, the wind did not fall at once. On it went, moaning and rushing past the house, at times rising to a cry so desolate it might have made fanciful people feel quite uncomfortable. Even the unimaginative, he thought, after a quarter of an hour, might be happier without it. As with the thin, dry voice of Nicholas Franken in number 13, whose horrific singing sailed up and was then carried down with a disappearing moan, the sudden wind which accompanies Parkins' blow of the whistle is given anthropomorphic qualities, moaning, rushing, and rising to a desolate cry, as if the wind was a corporeal being. So disturbing are the wind's almost tactile qualities that even after a quarter of an hour, it is still capable of inspiring a sense of terror in a skeptical Cambridge professor, albeit somewhat minimized by the euphemism, happier without it. Whistling and wind are connected in folklore, of course, itself originally an oral tradition, and a subject of fascination to James, which has been well documented. A fellow resident at the seaside resort in Burnstow, referred only as the Colonel, remarks upon the freakish weather of the previous evening when he and Parkins meet upon the golf course the next morning. He informs Parkins, "In my old home, we should have said someone was whistling for it." Parkins, the pragmatist, is of course dismissive of such comments, but the Colonel, an ancien militaire, secretary of a London club and possessed of a voice of incredible strength, declares that, superstitious or not, they believe in it all over Denmark and Norway, as well as on the Yorkshire coast. And he is of the opinion that there's generally something at the bottom of what these country folk hold to. Historically, sailors have always maintained that whistling while out or near the sea will conjure wind. And at least since the beginning of the 18th century, whistling after dark in any situation has been regarded as unwise, based on the idea that it summons spirits and draws attention to oneself. James's singling out of Denmark, Norway, and the Yorkshire coast in his example would suggest that his research into Scandinavian folklore links these particular places to Viking customs. Of note is that one of the qualifiers used by James to delineate the Colonel as a personage of dependability and repute is the possession of a voice of incredible strength. Sonic quality here equates with strength of character and trustworthiness, hegemonic markers denoting a rigid order of martial masculinity. Reducing the Colonel's name to his military rank also serves to strengthen the idea that he is a man of reason rather than fancy or superstition. Again, we see the privileging of the oral over the visual. The naysayer Parkins then subjects the Colonel to a lengthy disquisition on his theory as regards to whistling for the wind, based upon what he considers to be incontrovertible facts of physics. The whistle, of course, has not only summoned a potentially destructive wind, but a malign entity whose only purpose is to destroy. One of James's formidable agents of supernatural malice. The room Parkins occupies contains 2 beds, and from the one he does not sleep in, he perceives a tossing and rustling. Upon lighting a match, he hears a scurry across the floor from the side of his bed with much rustling. Here the visual escapes perception, while the aural is present in the rustling from a source unseen. The following day, after successful rounds of golf with the Colonel, the latter is almost knocked down as he and Parkins return to the hotel by a boy speechless with fright. Echoing the wind of 2 nights previously, the boy began to howl, and when the Colonel tries to divest himself of the boy, who is now clinging to his leg, the latter continued to howl. From inarticulate animal-like sounds, James then conveys the boy's terror through dialect. "Oh, I seen it way back out the window and I don't like it." According to the boy, it is a figure of some sort in white and it weren't a right thing. The boy's speech is as structureless as the shape he sees in Parkinson's window. When the 2 men enter Parkins' bedroom, they notice that on the bed, which Parkins does not use, the bedclothes were bundled up and twisted together in a most tortuous fashion, which leaves Parkins pondering for a plausible explanation. At this point, Parkins shows the Colonel the whistle, which he discovered at the Templar Preceptory. The colonel pronounces it should be chucked straight out into the sea, and the men bid each other good night. After sleeping soundly for an hour, a sudden clatter shakes Parkins up in a most unwelcome manner. Otherness, in its many different guises, is constructed aurally as well as visually. The otherness of that which Parkins has conjured with the whistle announces its presence aurally long before it is clearly perceived visually. After being awakened, Parkins lies with all his eyes open, breathlessly listening. James's choice of words here is startling. With all his eyes open serves to emphasize the futility of dependence on or preference for the sense of sight over sound. For due to his innate skepticism, Parkins still does not see. However many eyes he has opened, what his actions have wrought. The reader-listener of the tale is situated by the narrator in bed with Parkins. There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed on the opposite side of the room. Then it was quiet. No, the commotion began again, a rustling and shaking. James forces his audience to participate in the same disturbing oral experience as his character, and neither the audience nor the later readership can see what is there, but they all experience it orally in some way, and Parkins's ensuing mental collapse. James's ghosts and revenants are presented in such a way that they appear to affect the physical senses, even when they cannot be seen. James is especially adept at conveying tactile horror. The aural and the tactile are all the more terrifying for their source remaining unseen. It is the feel of something pressed against his face, rustling incessantly as it forces him backward toward an open window, which causes Parkins to undergo a psychotic break and subsequent crisis of faith. Parkins then perceives what he believes is a horrible, an intensely horrible face of crumpled linen. The fear of it went nigh to maddening him, and halfway through the window backwards, he utters cry upon cry at the utmost pitch of his voice. Had the colonel not suddenly intervened, Parkins would either have fallen out of the window or else lost his wits. In the animated intensity of the ordinary, a seemingly ordinary bedsheet has, via rustling, scurrying, and smothering, caused a stolid naysayer to reevaluate the judgments which had sustained his existence for a number of decades. At the conclusion of the tale, the narrator informs us that the professor's views on certain points are less clear-cut than they used to be. His nerves, too, have suffered. The visual and tactile horror of the face of crumpled linen have pushed Parkins to reevaluate his beliefs. But the alien soundscape of the wind, which accompanies the mesmeric sound of the whistle, a sound which can cross infinite distances, triggering a hypnotic feedback loop alongside an indistinct but malevolent entity, has also contributed to the levelling of Parkins's cynicism. Mr. Humphreys and his inheritance. This and A Neighbour's Landmark both have an alien soundscape that acts as a border marking the territory of a contested space. M.R. James wrote in his preface to the Collected Stories in 1931 that Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance was executed simply to fill up the 1911 volume More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. However, Mr. Humphreys is in fact the first story in which James utilized the motif of acoustic chaos. While sonic imagery is not the dominant feature of this story, as it is in the later A Neighbour's Landmark, it is no less effective when it is deployed. It is sound as alien, unfamiliar, other, which causes anxiety, a notion of there being an us and a them, whoever we and they may be. Whispering and rustling with no visual source, which unaccountably follows a person through a landscape, causing disorientation and panic, is easily transmuted into the sound of malevolence as a physical entity by a master of the supernatural like James. Mr. Humphreys inherits a house upon the death of an uncle who he doesn't really know. And part of the large gardens includes a maze. It has been locked and overgrown for decades, his uncle having forbidden entry to it. While Humphreys waits for the maze to be cleared for exploration, obviously, he investigates the uncle's library and comes across a 17th century volume of sermons in a rather dilapidated condition, in the margins of which the original owner has penned a tale, Parable of the Unhappy Condition. This embedded narrative revolves around a man who resolves to enter a labyrinth or maze in order to obtain a jewel of great price and rarity contained within. Naturally, friends try to dissuade the man, as the maze is known to harbour pitfalls and snares, and ill-omened inhabitants which lurk in the corridors of the topiary. Once the man enters the gates, his friends hear no more of him, except for cries afar off in the night, which make them turn in their restless beds and sweat for very fear. As with his previous stories, James emphasizes the notion that the aural is more terrifying than the visual. The acoustic chaos which the parable centers around is introduced by James when, in the embedded story, the unnamed man retrieves the jewel and then sets out to return to the maze entrance. The man becomes sensible of some creature keeping pace with him in the next alley, stopping when he stops, continuing when he does. The archaic language used by James as a disconnecting device serves to place the reader at a distance from the immediate action, so that they become helpless witnesses to the horrific event being described. And indeed, as the darkness increased, it seemed to him that there was more than one, and it might be even a whole band of such followers, at least so he judged, by the rustling and cracking that they kept among the thickets. Besides that, there would be at a time a sound of whispering, which seemed to import a conference among them. But in regard of who they were, or what form they were of, he would not be persuaded to say what he thought. When the man is found the next morning lying in the road in a swooned most like death, he is questioned as to the cries heard the previous night. About midnight, he heard his name called from a long way off, and he would have hallooed at the pitch of his voice, and he supposed that the echo or noise of his shouting disguised for the moment any lesser sound, because when there fell a stillness again, he distinguished a trampling, not loud, of running feet coming very close behind him, wherewith he was so daunted that himself set off into a run, and that he continued till the dawn broke. Sometimes, when his breath failed him, he would cast himself flat on his face and hope that his pursuers might overrun him in the darkness. But at such a time, they would regularly make pause, and he could hear them pant and snuff, as it had been a hound at fault, which wrought in him so extreme an horror of mind that he would be forced to betake himself again, and turning and doubling, as if by any means he might throw off the scent. This passage conveys how precisely James chose the words he used in which to delineate the atmosphere of acoustic chaos. Pitch, voice, echo, noise, and trampling all serve to highlight the auditory confusion the man in the embedded narrative is being subjected to. The man is being assaulted almost physically by waves of sound that undulate, washing over him and swirling around him, so that he is unable to fix a particular point of origin. The unnamed man of the parable has experienced touching at a distance. He is forced to cast himself flat on his face and hope that his pursuers might overrun him in the darkness. He feels compelled to throw them off the scent, as if they were hounds taking part in a hunt. From a psychiatric point of view, one could also ask if these moments of orality qualify as hallucinations of hearing. James leaves the episode ambiguous, ending the embedded narrative with, "I will spare to set down the further recital of this man's troubles." The word recital itself is an interesting choice, being a musical term for a performance by a small group. Has the unnamed man's theft of the jewel triggered a concert of cacophony calculated to inspire terror? Whether or not the parable was meant to be read by Mr. Humphreys himself as a warning of the dangers of seeking access to that which is forbidden, he goes ahead with his exploration anyway, of course, of his uncle's maze the following day, accompanied by two new female acquaintances. The group become lost, confusion ensues, and the gardener arrives in response to repeated shouting. However, as the gardener searches for them, he has some difficulty in making his way to the party. First he is seen or heard in an inside alley, then, almost at the same moment, in an outer one. The experience of Humphreys and his party mirrors that of the man in the parable, as they are each subjected to sounds that have a distorting effect upon their vision. Sounds that undulate and swirl, causing acoustic confusion. The maze is a soundscape of malice and is duly razed to the ground when Humphreys discovers its creator's ashes are stored in a globe at the centre, a globe which features inscriptions dedicated to various deities of death and pandemonium. A Neighbour's Landmark, published 13 years later, extends the motif of acoustic chaos and the science of sound by introducing a figure from Scandinavian folklore, the shrieking ghost. In many places, such as China, India, and the Middle East, certain spectres are believed to be inhabited, certain spaces, are believed to be inhabited by voices. Betton Wood, the site of Aural haunting in A Neighbour's Landmark, is an alien soundscape whose inhabitant, evil or otherwise, is constrained within borders of a contested piece of land. James owned several volumes of the local legends from Jutland, among which would have found a good many shrieking ghosts. This motif almost invariably occurs in association with another, the ghost whose walking is a punishment for dishonest appropriation of land. The presence inhabiting Betton Wood had coveted and then appropriated the land of another. And not only has James transported the figure from Scandinavian folklore to an English setting, he has heightened the horror by changing a mere shout to an ear-shattering shriek. An ear-shattering shriek is, of course, acoustically much more effective as a tool of auditory torture. In terms of narration, A Neighbour's Landmark is one of the very few James tales written in the first person. It provides an intimate insight into the ability of an alien soundscape to ravage the intellect through extrinsic sounds, which can distort perception and sensation. That which walks in Betton Wood knows why it walks or why it cries, is the refrain through which the listener, is introduced to the terrifying spectre of A Neighbour's Landmark. The unnamed narrator, having read of the now stumped up Betton Wood in the library of his host, Mr. Phillipson, decides to explore, of course. Upon nearing the area for the first time, he is suddenly assailed by a shriek, which thrilled into my right ear, piercing my head in a note of incredible sharpness, like the shriek of a bat, only 10 times intensified, the kind of thing that makes one wonder if something has not given way in one's brain. The narrator held his breath and covered his ear and shivered. Shriek, pierce, and sharpness all evoke sensory images of a sound that is capable of physically wounding, a sound that can touch at a distance. The initial contact of the voices makes the protagonist all at once turn as if stung. James portrays the sense of hearing as being intimately bound up with that of tactility, as in the maze scene in the parable set within Mr. Humphrey's inheritance. The disembodied voice is, as a signifier of the uncanny and alien, is a well-used trope of Gothic fiction and supernatural fiction, but James channels the phenomenon through a first-person experience in such a way that his readers share in the aural horror suffered by his protagonist. The auditory assault is repeated, and just then into my left ear, close as if lips had been put within an inch of my head, the frightful scream came thrilling again. Imagery that links lips and ears is vocalized for a listener who responds physically to the sensory experience, is the hallmark of an author who understands the nuances of the spoken as well as the written word. As a polyglot and consummate mimic, James was able to manipulate language in order to exploit an array of sonic signifiers capable of disturbing the psyche to such an extent that both listeners and readers are able to conjure images of this shrieking ghost of Betton Wood long after the story has concluded. A scream which is at once hideous, jarring, and piercing, emanating from an unseen source, is a physical phenomena without a neurological correlate. Hideous it was beyond anything I had heard of or heard since. I confess myself that I was afraid, so jarred were all my nerves with the cry on the hill. This scream appears to pierce right through from one ear to the other. Such sounds cannot be explained, charted, and described. Phillipson later recounts to the narrator a statement given to him by a local during his investigations. But no one can't avoid the curse that's laid on them that removes that landmark, and so she can't leave Betton. The progenitor of the acoustic chaos in a neighbour's landmark remains trapped within a landscape which acts as a border, marking the territory of a space that will remain contested. In conclusion, you're all glad to hear, hearing is perhaps the most intimate and existential of senses. Sounds, voices, auditory images are all elusive shapeshifters. Aural hallucinations conflate source and destination. The man trying to leave the maze in Parable in Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance is overrun by whistlings and rustlings and creaking sounds created by the ill-omened inhabitants who keep pace with him, stopping when he stops, starting when he starts. Elements like the savage wind conjured by a whistle in "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You" create a standing wave of sound which folds back upon itself and builds up in complex layers. The whistle itself exhibits a tonal frequency, triggering a feedback loop which is hypnotic and induces a moment of vivid mental imagery and hallucination in the protagonist, Professor Parkins. The tales of M.R. James can be read as a refutation of the notion that society tends to privilege the visual over the oral. Many believe that seeing something provides better proof than hearing something. Yet the guests and landlord at the Golden Lion Hotel unquestioningly believe what they hear coming from number 13, but cannot account for a mysterious door that only appears at night, or the proportions of their room altering each evening to accommodate it. In the stories I've discussed, M.R. James favours alien soundscapes that disorient and confuse over spectres who appear in clear visual form to threaten their victims and instill terror. Sound arrives in the ear as a tangible entity, triggering powerful emotional responses. The shrieking ghost of Betton Wood causes the protagonist to all at once turn as if stung. Her scream appears to pierce right through from one ear to the other, her lips seeming to be only an inch from the auditor's ear, but she remains invisible to him. Ambient sounds of the natural world are suddenly intensified when Parkins seems to develop a heightened awareness of them after discovering the whistle. He becomes acutely receptive to the sound of the murmuring sea and his feet rattling and clashing through the shingle. James conveys terror to the reader or listener through extrinsic sounds, the sources for which are always unseen. M.R. James's supernatural tales were originally written for a listening audience who would hang on the author's every word. His power to evoke sonic nuances, aural imagery, and alien soundscapes secured for him the accolade of being described as the greatest of ghost story writers. James's mimetic brilliance and ear for language ensured that he was essentially able to think with his ears. James understood the texture, shape, density, timbre, and rhythm of sound, deploying these elements in order to concoct the perfect atmosphere and nicely managed crescendo, his two prerequisites for the perfect ghost story. I'll leave the last word to the master himself.